Welcome to Edified, a Christian book podcast that equips busy pastors with concise, accessible, and engaging wisdom as they labor in the trenches of ministry. My guest today is Dr. Ben Shaw. Ben received his PhD from Liberty University, where he currently serves as adjunct professor of theology, in addition to serving as an affiliate faculty member at Colorado Christian University. He's the president of CORE Apologetics, a ministry that helps churches, organizations, and individuals use apologetics to equip disciples and reach skeptics. Ben has worked with Gary Habermas for over 10 years to collaborate in philosophical, historical, and theological research and publishing, including Habermas's Gargantuan On the Resurrection series, which you can see, Volume 1 right behind me. We'll be discussing Ben's new book, just released by IVP Academic, called Trustworthy, 13 Arguments for the Reliability of the New Testament. It's a good-looking cover. Ben, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and get to talk about some of these great topics today.
Yeah, awesome. So before we get started, could you share your story of how you got into apologetics in the first place? And also, where did the connection with Dr. Habermas come from?
Yeah. So it's a pretty interesting story. It's a good reminder, too, for a lot of us. But I got saved when my babysitter took me to church. And so I was at a Sunday school there and heard a Sermon on the Mount and recognized Jesus as Lord. But I was young, and so I had a lot to learn, but I didn't really get discipled much after that. God definitely, I say this a lot, God had oases for me along the way. But I grew up in South Florida, and so lots of things going on, good, bad, and ugly down there. And so I was, asking myself these questions. I'm in a county with 4 million people, trying to understand, the different worldviews and my own worldview. And so kind of put those to the side. I started playing ice hockey. Again, kind of weird in South Florida to do that. But I worked at an ice rink and was able to play a lot of hockey. I started really late. I ended up living in Connecticut for a while playing ice hockey. Played junior hockey up in Connecticut and enjoyed that. But I did notice there was a little bit of a difference of New England and South Florida. The trees turn brown, the sky turns gray, there's white snow everywhere. You got to start your car 20 minutes early if you want to go anywhere. I was not used to that. I was not used to that at all. And so I was like, you know what? If I'm going to play hockey, it's a little bit warmer in Florida. The palm trees are quite pleasant to look at, so I'll go back home and play there. So I did that, and I played at Florida Atlantic University for a year. And that was my fourth college at the time. I'd been to a number of community college in between that time. So I was around 17 to 20. I was in Connecticut playing hockey. And then in Florida, I started going, I was attending a church. And one of the guys there was like, hey, Ben, you should go to Liberty University. You can learn about God a lot more. I know you're something you just thought I could do that. And so I was like, well, kind of like a diet starts Monday kind of thing. I was like, well, I could just learn about God here in Florida. But that didn't happen. That hadn't happened since then. So what ended up happening was 2 weeks later, he goes, well, they got an ice hockey team with a rink on campus. And I'm like, well, dude, you only know like 2 people who play hockey. You should have led with that. And so I looked at their website, and sure enough, they had an awesome rink on campus, nice locker room, and I applied like the next day, and within 2 weeks, I was at Liberty. And so while I was there, I got to ask questions about God that I had, and so, when we talk about apologetics, for example, some people think it's this crazy word. It is kind of a crazy word, definitely not something we use in our everyday language, but one of the things I learned at Liberty was Paul wrote half the New Testament. Kind of a big deal. Okay.
Yep.
He wrote a lot of these letters. That's important to know. I didn't know that. So again, I wasn't discipled. And so, sometimes I'll talk to people. Is knowing Paul wrote Romans and 1 Corinthians, is that a discipleship question or an apologetics question? Yes, is kind of the answer there. So those were some of the things I started to learn. And then I met the former hockey coach too during, in between one of my classes. His name was Gary Habermas. I'm like, oh, that's cool. Nice to meet you. We're the new school, so we have to think we're better than you guys were, otherwise we wouldn't be, we got to have some sort of confidence in our abilities. So I met him, and we just passed by. I thought he was the former hockey coach. And then I was an undergrad in marketing. So that was my initial degree. and I did graduate with the undergrad marketing, but we ended up getting connected in a long turn of events. So I ended up doing a master's in religious studies. I still hadn't really connected with him much at that point, but I had become familiar with his material, and I read The Case for the Resurrection with him and Dr. Mike Licona. Excellent book on the subject, probably one of the best ones out there, especially for an introductory book, but it's also pretty in depth as well. So I was doing that, and I did my master's thesis on Jesus' resurrection using the minimal facts approach, which Gary Habermas is known for, and it's considered to be the most popular and most widely used approach to establishing the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. And so I started doing that, and so he heard about me through those kind of channels, and I did my master's was in religious studies because, again, I'm from Fort Lauderdale. Millions of people, millions of different worldviews. What's distinct and different about Christianity was one of the questions I had. Resurrection is one of the answers there. Then I ended up doing a PhD because I still had questions. I had a whole lot of questions. And in that process, I was able to become his research assistant. So he heard, there's a former hockey player doing resurrection research, and his research assistant was getting ready to move on. And so he asked me if I could partner with him. And I was like, yeah, this sounds awesome. And so that's what we did. And shortly after I started with him, he was talking about doing this magnum opus on this 4-volume series on Jesus's resurrection, where each volume would be about 1,000 pages. And so that's what we were doing for a lot of those years. But in the midst of that, he still had other publications. He had other classes. He had other presentations and lectures he would give. So he had been doing a lot of work in that time. But we were able to, I was able to contribute a little bit, hopefully, to that process. And now his big 1,000-page volume 1 is out. Now volume 2 is coming out very soon as well. It's a little bit shorter, only about 950 pages. So, just a little bit lighter. But yeah, so that's how I got connected with him. And we share a lot in common. And so, yeah, it's been really, really fun working with him and getting to do research with him as well.
Awesome. So what is CORE Apologetics, and what does it offer for not only pastors, but also business people, students, anybody else?
Yeah. Great question. So we started CORE Apologetics. I should say we relaunched CORE Apologetics in October and November. CORE Apologetics was founded by a gentleman named Ron Davis, and he actually came to Liberty and got his PhD at Liberty as well. And Ron came to Liberty to study questions about doubt and how to help those who are doubting and have questions. And Dr. Habermas also has done a number of books on that subject, and he's no stranger to that topic either. Mm-hmm. And so when Habermas started working on his MO, in one of his classes, he asked, hey guys, I am not going to have as much time to talk to doubters that I used to have. Can someone help take some of these doubters? And Ron put his hand up. He said, I'll be happy to do it. That's what I want to do. And so he started doing that. And he's talked to hundreds of doubters since then. I believe over 1,300 or so doubters. Wow. And so he started CORE Apologetics back then, but it was just really focused on dealing with doubt. In October, November of last year, Ron and I had been talking a little bit before that. We relaunched CORE Apologetics. And the aim is to use apologetics to help equip disciples and minister to those who are doubting. Because sometimes it's disciples who have questions. Again, if I'm asking who wrote Romans or 1 Corinthians, is that a discipleship question or an apologetics question? It's a little bit of both. Yeah. So we started doing that. And part of my burden was I felt like I had to go get a master's degree and a PhD to get discipled. And I'm burdened about that because I don't think we should have to do that. I don't think that should be a prerequisite to get discipled. Amen. So our goals are to help. Yes, our goal is to help churches equip their leaders, equip new believers to major on the majors. We're CORE Apologetics. So, Jesus' resurrection is obviously fundamental to what we're doing. We're carrying on a lot of Dr. Habermas's ministry. We're just trying to get it out of the universities and into the churches and organizations. So that's what we're trying to do, because that will help make disciples. Because when you have those, if a hockey guy, I joke and say, if a hockey guy like me can get this stuff, we can all get it. And that's how it should be, because people are serving at their church, they're serving in their businesses, they have families that they need to attend to. They have all sorts of things going on, and they can't go to seminary. And we really don't want everybody going to seminary because there's different parts of the body. We want everyone to be equipped well, but there's some fundamentals that we have that enables us to, when we go to our discipline, whatever it is, medical, law, business, construction, whatever, we want to be people who do so grounded in the truths of the gospel and as disciples following Jesus. So to do that, like, what are some of the foundational beliefs? New Testament reliability, is a question we'll get often asked. So that was a topic we wanted to discuss and help equip believers with. But the key is to make disciples who can then make disciples. So you've got a number of church leaders or small group leaders, life group leaders, and you want to equip them. We're trying to help do that. And so those are some of the things we want to do that should help lessen some of the burden on the pastors, but also help strengthen and make the church more robust and more well equipped to make disciples amongst themselves. So, they're in a small group and someone asks them a question about Jesus's death or reliability of the New Testament. They can engage them, but also as they understand their faith better, they can better stand for it wherever they are at in their workplace or in their family or whatever the case may be. So those are some of the things we're trying to do. And then with organizations, there's a lot of great Christian organizations out there. What we're trying to do is be that apologetic thread to help strengthen the cord of their organization. So just bring some of that equipping, some of that training, because again, there's different parts of the body. We want godly farmers out there because we like to eat, right? So we want godly farmers. We don't want everybody, as Paul says, we don't want to say to the hand, "Where's your sense of smell?" or something to that effect. So anyway, that's some of our goals. We're very new, and we are looking for some partners with us. It's just Ron and myself right now, and I'm doing this full time. So we're looking for people who can help partner with us and join with us. And as core project partners is what we're calling it. And so part of what we do with that, those who are able to partner with us, is we want to give scholarships to certain classes that we do, whether it's resurrection, discipleship, dealing with doubt, or New Testament reliability, that their church members can attend. So we have all sorts of things on there that we're trying to do so we can partner with churches and organizations with.
Awesome. So you've got a website, I know you've got a LinkedIn page. Where else can people find out about CORE Apologetics and sign up to be partners or to just learn more?
Yes, www.coreapologetics.com. We have a LinkedIn page. I'm on LinkedIn as well. So is Ron. We are both on Facebook. I'm renew to Facebook, I guess you could say. I had been off, but Ron was like, "Ben, you got to come back on, because people are going to want to ask you questions." So I've recently got back on Facebook, and then we also have a Instagram and a TikTok. No, we don't have TikTok. Take that out. Twitter or X. But it's just Ron and myself, and so we're just starting on those other forms of social media. Ron had started them a while back, but since we've relaunched, we're trying to build up our base. But primarily, coreapologetics.com or LinkedIn are two of the better ways.
Awesome. All right. So now that we've got some of the background out of the way, why did you write this book now? And if part of what CORE Apologetics is trying to do is taking Dr. Habermas's work and kind of making it way more accessible for the average person, is this book more for, say, scholars and pastors, or can it be used more accessibly for just the average Christian in the pew?
Yeah, I think it's going to be more for pastors and the average person in the pew. It's not for the academic crowd. They may find it helpful in the sense of a systematic presentation of the reliability arguments, or it could be good for an undergrad student, just introducing it to them, because that was the initial audience. I was writing to the Ben Shaw who was just going to Liberty, like, "Hey, these are some of those questions you had when you were coming in, which would have been really helpful for you to get answered right away." And so that's kind of my initial audience there. It could be kids from high school going to college, or if you're not going to college, in that early 20s kind of age group. But pastors may also benefit from it too, because they can help equip the church with some of these tools, because that's the idea. I didn't mention this earlier, but I've got a black belt in jiu-jitsu. And so
Oh man.
one of the
Okay.
things, yeah, but one of the things we don't want to do is like give you these crazy moves that you can't do unless you've done years of practice, right? You've got to learn the fundamentals. So this is like, these are the effective moves, so to speak, right out of the gate. Like if you're going to come learn some stuff, like these are the key ones to do takeaways from. And so now you can start understanding when you're reading scripture. Now you may be more equipped and encouraged to read it because you're understanding, oh, there's an author to this book and his name's Paul, or whatever the case may be. So those are some helpful bits. But also, one of the other key groups that we were looking for is those in the business world. I worked a full-time job in the insurance industry while I was getting my PhD and Dr. Habermas's research assistant. So I didn't lose touch, with the outside world and concrete reality, and I wasn't just in the ivory tower of academics, as people say.
Yeah.
So and that's important because on average, this is a Barna study. Pastors will speak to about 8.8 million non-believers and nominal Christians throughout the year. Business owners will speak to about 118 million non-believers and nominal Christians. So they really need to be equipped with this information because they're engaging it much more frequently.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to be asked questions much more frequently than a pastor may. And so how do we equip them? What are the basics that they need to know? And so this book is aimed at doing that. Each of the chapters in the book has been a dissertation or a book in and of itself. So it's just there to give them those introductory aspects, but also to see the breadth in which the New Testament is in fact reliable and trustworthy.
Right. So you've got 13 arguments here, and I just want to touch on the ones that come in chapters 5, 6, and 7, so we can hit those in order. You talk about creeds. So we may hear that word, creed, and think of the Nicene Creed or the Chalcedonian Creed, but you're not going 3 or 4 centuries deep into church history. You're talking about New Testament creeds or creedal traditions. Well, first off, could you tell us what you mean by that? Also, like, where do these show up in Scripture? Do we have them in the pages of our Bible? And
Yes.
how did those come about?
Yes. So when we refer to New Testament creeds, a lot of people do think, Nicene Creed or something like that. But that is not what we're talking about. So don't let those ideas cloud your thought right now.
Mm-hmm.
What we want to focus on is New Testament creeds. And what New Testament creeds are, they are oral formulas that were preserved in writing. And the classic example of this is in 1 Corinthians 15, in Paul's resurrection chapter, and the longest chapter on the resurrection in the New Testament. And Paul starts with a New Testament creed, and he says, "I delivered to you that which I also received." And then he goes on to say that Jesus died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose 3 days later according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by. And then he goes on to list these different appearances. When Paul prefaces that with, "I delivered to you that which I received," he's using technical language there that rabbis would have used for passing down tradition. So there's a very intentional delivery being done here. He does it earlier in 1 Corinthians 11 as well with respect to the Lord's Supper. And so we see these different elements. Now, what's interesting is that there's a number of different reasons too, in addition to Paul's comments there. Those are just two. That's just one reason why that's considered a New Testament creed. In the Greek, it's got some parallelisms and some other indicators that make it a creed. But what's really significant about that, and by the way, scholars think there's probably anywhere from, depending on who you ask, there could be up to 24 or so different creeds within the New Testament. So
Wow.
Romans 10:9 is often considered one, Romans 1:3-4, Philippians 2:5-11. Those are some. But 1 Corinthians 15 is just the great test case, not just because I'm partial to resurrection texts, but maybe because I'm partial to resurrection texts. Now, what's really interesting, though, about the creed is, okay, great, it's a creed. So what? What's your point? Well, if Paul's delivering to the church in Corinth what he received, where did he receive this creed? Like, who's giving it to him? Is Paul just making this up? What's going on? He said he received it, so he must have had this formal transmission to him as well. In Galatians 1, Paul says just 3 years after his conversion, he went to Jerusalem and met with James and Peter. And so Paul calls them in Galatians 2, two pillars of the church. So two significant people you'd want to meet with. And Paul uses the word, depending on your translation, there's a couple different ways the word's translated. It could be inquired. It could be visited with. Two slightly different nuances there depending on the word. But the Greek word is hysteresis, where we get our word history from. Yeah. So he's going there. This word has that connotation of getting firsthand knowledge. So Paul's wanting to talk to Peter and James. And so what's interesting in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul's, before he says, I delivered to you that which I received, he says, he's reminding the church in Corinth of the gospel he preached, that which has the power to save and is of first importance. In Galatians 1, he's also talking about the gospel. So we know this is a core topic. So there's a famous saying that said, we may presume they did more than talk about the weather during Paul's time with Peter and James. Yeah. So this isn't an evangelical, this isn't a conservative argument. This is widely recognized to be the meeting where Paul likely received this creedal information. So scholars will date vaguely to the early 30s, this creed in 1 Corinthians 15, as well as a number of other creeds. So early 30s AD is when you can date these creeds. It just depends on when you think Jesus died, 30, 33 AD. Those can vary. So it's just easy to go, hey, bottom line, early 30s AD. And you go, well, what if Paul didn't receive it there? What if he received it in Damascus with Ananias when he met him? Well, that's possible. But we see here that Peter and James, eyewitnesses, even if Paul got it at that earlier date, they would have confirmed the content of the creed at that date. And also in 1 Corinthians 15, there's 3 individuals listed as having seen the Lord. It's Peter, James, and Paul. So it's kind of an interesting connection there. And then in Galatians 2, by the way, Paul goes on to say, he goes back to Jerusalem 14 years later. And again, they give him the right hand of fellowship, or it says they give him the right hand of fellowship, rather. And this time John is there. So Peter, James, and John giving Paul the right hand of fellowship. So we see here, it's not only a very early creed, but even the late Pinchas Lapide says we might consider this eyewitness testimony. So very good data. Again, just another reason why the New Testament is trustworthy here.
Yeah, and I definitely want to pick your brain a little bit on Paul and James and their conversions a little bit later on, because those are also a really good argument for the New Testament's reliability. But getting into some more historical things, in chapter 6, you talk about the fact that there's a lot of embarrassing testimony given by the main figures of the early church. It's a chapter much more widely covering all the historical criteria. And of course, you worked in insurance, so picking apart different scenarios of like, well, what happened in this car crash or different things like that. Yeah. I'll edit this out. I'm just totally blanking on where I was going to go. But you talk about the fact that there's a lot of embarrassing testimony. Oh, okay. So one of the main things that I used in a very long conversation with an atheist friend of mine who I've been friends with for over 10 years was the embarrassing testimony. And I shared this with him a few years ago, just regarding like the women at the tomb running away and all the disciples deserting Jesus, all these different things. And after I was done talking to him, he was like, I had never heard 95% of that. And one of the biggest things I tried to drive home was the fact that men don't die for things they know are lies. There was a lot to, well, you know what, let me let you get into that. But yeah, it just gets me really excited because I've found that that's a really good way, because people in our day tend to only want to believe something that they see on closed circuit TV. Well, give me the footage or else it didn't happen. Well, they didn't have that 2,000 years ago. So this is the best thing we have. And again, let me shut up and let you get on with it.
No, that's good, because I get the same way. We want to be excited about these things because they are exciting. And the good news, part of the good news for us is we have stuff to be excited about. But one of the unfortunate things is that many believers don't know that data either. And so that's some of the stuff we're trying to get out, and so people can be aware of it as well. Even when we just stick with Peter, James, and Paul, since we were mentioning them, they have a ton of embarrassing features about them in the New Testament. And before I get to those, I actually use a car accident story when I'll share about historical criteria sometimes. And if you were to come onto a scene and you wanted to know who was at fault, you'd have to look for multiple witnesses, preferably if you can have them. You don't always have them, but if we got them, great. And retweets don't count. So if someone just copies what you said, that does not count. That's not on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
But so we want multiple independent sources. That's a criteria. And a lot of these criteria, they're intuitive. We do them today, whether it's insurance. There are some criteria that may be a little unique to the ancient world, but that's okay. That we don't dictate to our question how it's supposed to answer us. We have to investigate it. But some things are the same. Multiple witnesses is one of them. If one of the witnesses, for example, was my wife, and she was like, "Yep, it was my husband's fault. Get him. Yep, he wasn't paying attention, and I told him to stop, and he wasn't listening, so it was his fault." That's considered embarrassing testimony because she's working against her interests, but she's doing so because she believed it to be the truth, and she was willing to suffer because if I cause the accidents, insurance rates go up, etc. So that would be a good example there. Another one is enemy attestation. If your rival saw the accident and they were like, "Yeah, as much as I wish it was his fault, it wasn't." That's good evidence that adds a weight to the historicity of the event. And so the criteria typically only add weight to the historicity of an event. They don't take it away. So for example, if you don't have embarrassing testimony, it's not a mark against it. There's only one criterion that may be an exception to that, and that is context or consistent. It's more contextual coherence. So if I was like, the disciples were riding around on motorcycles, you'd be like, okay, that's not consistent with the period. There's no context in which the disciples are riding motorcycles.
Mm-hmm.
So if it fails that, then you're like, okay, now that's a mark against it.
I can't get that image out of my head now, by the way.
Yeah, now you're going to be thinking about that all day. And I don't even ride motorcycles, but that's just an image. I was like, oh, that's a curious thought. Anyway,
Peter would totally have a motorcycle. Yeah.
maybe that's why I was thinking it. Yeah, and so when it comes to, for example, Peter, James, and Paul's reluctant, like he's not excited about how he persecuted the church. It's something he says in 1 Corinthians, as one untimely born. So he understands there's something different about him. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Peter's called Satan. I mean, that they could have left that out, and they didn't. So
yeah.
That's, to me, I mean, that's a big one. And then James, Jesus's brother, he was a skeptic during Jesus's own life, and the Gospels don't hide that. They could have. James was a leader of the early church, and John says even his brothers weren't believing him. So, and it's not just John, by the way. It's got multiple independent attestation because Mark also reports it in Mark 3. So we have multiple sources. It's in the earliest gospel. It's highly embarrassing. So we see the criteria coming together to add weight to the historicity of these events we find in the New Testament. But again, why they could have, James could have been like, you guys could have left that part out. The story goes along just fine. But it's in there, and it's in there because there's a concern for the truth, and people were well aware of these things, so they wanted to make mention of them.
Yeah, and honestly, what's a bigger piece of embarrassing testimony than the crucifixion itself?
Yes.
Nobody.
Yep.
I mean, Paul talks about it, 1 Corinthians 1. I think you actually addressed this in the book, that's, he calls it a stumbling block to the Jews and a scandal or foolishness rather to the Gentiles, because it's like you worship someone who was crucified naked as a criminal, and all his followers deserted him, and he made all these big lofty claims, and he himself couldn't even come down from the cross, and you're saying that this guy rules the world. I think there's a piece of, I forget where it is. There's like a graffiti somewhere in Rome that basically just draws a man on a cross with the head of a donkey, and it's making fun of Christians. And it's like, that's how Christians were perceived, as being utter fools. And that's obviously a blasphemous graffiti, but that's the level of ridicule that Christians in the first century and even far beyond that, even still today, will get for believing what we believe. So
Yes, it says Alexamenos worships his God in the inscription below it.
yeah,
So it's and for the Romans and the Greco-Roman world, they would think the very word crucifixion shouldn't even be in their ears or on their thoughts. So it's
Hmm.
beneath them. Don't even tell me about it. I don't need to hear the word. I'm a Roman citizen. It is beneath me. And
Yeah,
then the Jews thought it was a stumbling block because Deuteronomy says anyone hung on a tree is cursed by God in
yeah,
21, 22, and 23. So it's not something that they're going to invent. And so those are all indicators. They're markers of trustworthiness and reliability and those sorts of things.
yeah. I thought your chapter, I think this is chapter 7, on undesigned coincidences was really interesting, especially how in different places, like in Matthew, how we know what Herod said to his servants,
Mhm.
or there's a very specific case, and I can let you get into that, of why Luke uses the plural of the word proconsul. He says proconsuls when
Mhm.
at the time there was only one, but you look at some outside evidence and you're like, oh, wait a minute, Luke actually had his finger on the pulse of what was going on politically at
Mhm.
the time, and it's clear that that was an undesigned coincidence. Can you talk about
Yes.
that a little bit?
Yes. So, and undesigned coincidences, if you had to, I'm a visual learner, so I like images. And so, if you think of two puzzle pieces made by two different people, but when they come together, they fit properly
Hmm.
together. Same image, but the notches and things like that fit together properly. That's an example of an undesigned coincidence because the two people making the cutouts, they're not going to know how the other person's cutting it out. They just have this image because maybe they're just describing the same event from two different perspectives.
Hmm.
But the notches fit in together. And so that's an undesigned coincidence. And a lot of times these are in secondary details. So it's not the sort of thing that they would have likely been trying to conspire together to be on the same page about. And secondly, not all of the examples, as you were just alluding to there, are within the New Testament. So we've got examples of different New Testament writings providing undesigned coincidences for one another, but we also have examples from outside the New Testament. So with the case that you're talking about in Acts 19, 38, Luke is describing the riot that's going on, and he goes, he references proconsuls, plural, like you were just saying. And everybody at that time knew there was only one proconsul. Like that'd be like us saying, the presidents are here, and you're like, what? There's only one president. What are you guys talking
Hmm.
about? This isn't making sense. So, but at that time, Tacitus, so a Roman historian, he mentions that at the same time the proconsul had been executed or assassinated, Silanus, and so the three normally a proconsul would have three people under him, and so those three people were likely those in charge during this time of transition. So in the midst of that chaotic scene there, trying to quell this riot that was starting to form. Hey guys, there's people we can talk to, okay? And so we see this, these things kind of coming together here. Another example is John. When in the feeding of the 5,000 in John 6, Jesus asks Philip where to get food. And so you
Hmm.
might go, okay, he's asking Philip where to get food. What's so significant about that? And in John 1, it tells us that Philip is from Bethsaida. And you're like, okay, again, what's so significant about that? He's asking this rhetorical question anyway. But if you're wondering why is he asking John, you have to go to Luke to get a little bit more of an answer. And Luke is the one that tells us the feeding of the 5,000 occurs in Bethsaida. So now you're illuminated to the fact that Jesus is asking someone local to the area where to get food. Again, they come together very complementary. They illuminate the text, and so I think those are some good examples of what an undesigned coincidence, how that can shed light on a two different texts coming together.
Hmm. Um, so I know you talked about this a little bit at the beginning, and I know that you give talks on this quite often, and that you've become pretty skilled at doing this in a brief time frame. But I know I'm totally just setting you up right now. uh, could you walk us through, or maybe not maybe not an elevator pitch. Say you're in an elevator and the elevator breaks. So you don't get like 30 seconds with someone. You get a couple of minutes. What's the minimal facts argument in a broken elevator?
Yes. Well, let me just preface this. What's so great about the minimal fact approach, I'm going to say this before I go into it,
Mhm.
is we were at a youth camp and sharing it with high school students who they can pick it up. But then at the same time, you can go to that book you have on your shelf there and get into it 1,000 pages deep. So you can go black belt levels deep, or you can say, hey, look, I just need to know, like, how do we know Jesus rose from the dead? And then I'm good, that I can go move on to whatever task I'm going to. So that's why I think it's such a beautiful argument. But the minimal facts approach, it has two criteria. The first one is that it only uses data that's highly evidenced. So very highly evidenced data historically. We're not saying it's true just because the Bible says so. We're going to see actually in a moment here, it works a little bit different than that. The second criterion is that it's widely accepted by scholars from all different backgrounds. So conservatives to non-conservatives, atheists, agnostics. I've got a book on my shelf where he just looks at what do Jewish scholars say on some of these minimal facts. So again, a wide range of scholars. And to be clear, the first criterion is the most important because it's the evidential one. It's why do we think this is true? The second kind of follows from it. If there is a multitude of arguments, then we would expect a multitude of scholars to be, yep, they're convinced by it as well. So these aren't idiosyncratic to evangelical conservatives or anything like that, but they're widely accepted facts. And you can use different levels, different numbers of facts depending upon your audience. So that's kind of nice too. Depends on how much time you have as another factor. So if your elevator is getting fixed, you can just use 4 or 5. The Case for the Resurrection, for example, that book it uses a 4+1, so you can do that. And Habermas's new book, he uses 6, so you can have some fluctuations there. Just depends on your audience. But the typical facts are that Jesus died. Let me back up. The other thing about this too is the approach. So I'm stopping my elevator pitch here to help position it.
Sure.
Whether you think the Bible's inerrant, inspired, it's a common ground approach. So that's the second criterion there. It's a common ground approach. We're using only data that skeptics allow. So if I think the Bible, this is a Habermasian comment, so I'm stealing it from him, but it's good. If I think the Bible's inerrant, inspired, we get a resurrection. If I think it's errant but pretty reliable, we get a resurrection. If I think it's errant and unreliable, we still get a resurrection. And so it's a pretty good deal, right? It sounds good, like a really good deal for us. But when we see what are some of these core facts, and we all know many of these core facts, we just don't understand that they're highly evidenced and widely agreed upon by scholars. So Jesus' death by crucifixion, we mentioned that, and we've talked about some of the key arguments for that. That the disciples had experiences of the risen Jesus. We mentioned that in 1 Corinthians 15 a little bit, as well as Paul and James and Peter. That they are reported early, and maybe a pop quiz for some people listening. The creeds, when were they dated? Early 30s. So we see some of this data coming from the very earliest proclamations, because again, that creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is the earliest evidence we have. Then we see that the disciples are willing to suffer and die for their beliefs. And again, that doesn't mean that we have evidence that all of them died. John, for example, he would be someone who wasn't martyred, but he was willing to suffer and die for his beliefs. The fifth is going to be the conversion of the skeptic James. Again, he was a skeptic, and then he became a believer in Jesus. And then sixth, the persecutor Paul converted and became a follower of Jesus. So those are 6 facts. We all know them. Maybe James is a little bit newer to us because he just kind of passes by our radar. But we understand that Jesus died on the cross. The disciples had experiences of him. They were willing to suffer and die for those, and that Paul converted. So each of those facts make alternative theories very, very difficult. For example, if we think, did the disciples steal the body? Well, let's think about and this is something I'll do even with the high school students. If we just look at the minimal facts, not going beyond them, what facts make that theory difficult or challenging? And one of them is, okay, well, they were willing to suffer and die. That's a challenge. Liars make poor martyrs, as Lacona says, or I believe it's Paul Meyer says, martyrs make poor myth makers. So, okay, that's one argument against it. The conversion of James is another argument because, again, he was a skeptic, and he's he's not in a position to be on board with whatever the disciples are doing. And then Paul probably thought the disciples stole the body. So why did he convert? It fails to account for his conversion. So we have three, you could say four, if you want to say the disciples had experiences of the risen Jesus. How did groups of people see the risen Jesus if the disciples stole the body? So it leaves a lot of questions, and that's just using the minimal facts. That's not unpacking things in deeper detail, but we can start to see, and we start to see similar things with other alternative theories, and largely we see that there's some reasons why skeptics, there's no consensus alternative to the resurrection. But I'll just leave that point there.
All right. Well, this has been great. You can pick up Ben's book, Trustworthy, 13 Arguments for the Reliability of the New Testament, along with all 4 volumes of Gary Habermas's On the Resurrection. You can pick those up right here at Christian Book. And Ben, Gary's working on, is it volume 4 right now on the pastoral application?
On volume 4. Now, okay. Yes, let me just note, volume 1 is just the historical evidence and historical method. So just essentially how to do history and what's the evidence. The second volume is just on alternative theories. So about 900 pages on alternative theories, 950 or so. Mm-hmm. The third volume is a spectrum of scholarly views. So it's just a catalog of what different scholars have said on different topics related to the resurrection. And the fourth volume is pastoral, practical, and worldview concerns. So how does it apply? And that one's going to be about 1,000 pages, and he's working on that one right now. So I spoke to him yesterday, and he's still working on it.
All right, yeah. So just some light reading, 1,000 pages, yeah. How many footnotes in this thing?
Oh, bro, yeah.
Because didn't you do them?
Volume 3 was the one, yes. So that one started with 8,800 footnotes. And so that was a lot of footnoting, and we've had to go through that one a number of times to edit it to make it proper for publication, because it was originally just a study document to help with research and things like that, and then it turned into this volume 3. So I should contrast that with Trustworthy is only 150 pages.
There you go.
radically different feel between the two.
Right. Yeah. Let me just hold this up for people who, if you can't see on the screen, it's about not even a half inch. So
yeah,
you can survive this one. Well, Ben, thank you again for joining me on the show today. I think this book's going to be a really valuable asset on the shelves of and in the hands of pastors, students, and just the average Christian layperson as they look for concrete answers to questions that they have, or that even their skeptical friends or coworkers or whoever else, family, have. So want to end the show the way try to end it every episode. So to you and your colleagues at CORE Apologetics, Ben, may God bless you as you strive to excel for the edification of the church. Thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. Appreciate all you guys are doing.